The early Christian movement was marked by significant theological and practical tensions, particularly between the Apostle Paul and the original disciples of Jesus, including James and Peter. I want to give an analysis of those tensions, examine their origins, manifestations, and their lasting impact on Christian theology and practice. Paul's approach to Jewish law and his conception of faith in Christ marked a radical departure from traditional Jewish teachings and the practices of the early Jerusalem church. This innovative theology is evident throughout his epistles, particularly in his letters to the Galatians and Romans. In Galatians 2:16, Paul articulates a core tenet of his theology. We know that a person is not justified by the works of the law, but by faith in Jesus Christ. So we too have put our faith in Christ Jesus, that we may be justified by faith in Christ and not by the works of the law, because by the works of the law no one will be justified. This statement encapsulates Paul's belief that faith in Christ rather than strict adherence to the law was the path to righteousness. Paul further emphasizes this point in Galatians chapter 5 verse 1, stating, "It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm, then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery." Here, Paul characterizes the law as a yoke of slavery, suggesting that it's overly restrictive and incompatible with the freedom offered through Christ. N.T. Wright elaborates on Paul's theological innovations, stating that Paul's radical reinterpretation of the Jewish law in light of Christ's death and resurrection represented a seismic shift in religious thought. He saw the law not as an end in itself, but as a temporary measure that pointed towards the ultimate fulfillment in Christ. This perspective is further reinforced in Romans chapter 7 verse 6, where Paul writes, "But now, by dying to what once bound us, we have been released from the law, so that we serve in the new way of the Spirit, and not in the old way of the written code." Paul's rhetoric consistently positions the law as an obstacle to the new spiritual life offered through Christ, a view that would have been deeply controversial among Jewish Christians. In contrast to Paul's innovative approach, if you could call it that, the original apostles in Jerusalem, particularly James, emphasized the continued importance of the Jewish law. This perspective is evident in the Epistle of James, traditionally attributed to James, the brother of Jesus and a leader in the Jerusalem church. James chapter 2 verse 24 states, "You see that a person is considered righteous by what they do, and not by faith alone." This verse underscores the belief that works, presumably including adherence to the law, are essential for righteousness. This stance appears to directly contradict Paul's emphasis on faith alone as the means of justification. Claudius Setzer argues that James represents a strand of early Christianity that saw no fundamental incompatibility between faith in Jesus and continued observance of the Torah. For James and his followers, the law remained an integral part of their religious identity and practice. The tension between the perspectives of Paul and James came to a head at the Jerusalem Council, as described in Acts 15. The Jerusalem Council provides a crucial snapshot of the tensions between Paul and the Jerusalem apostles. Paul and Barnabas traveled to Jerusalem to address the question of whether Gentile converts needed to be circumcised and follow the Mosaic law. This event highlights the fundamental disagreements about the role of Jewish law in the emerging Christian movement. John M.G. Barclay provides an insight into the significance of this council, noting that it represents a pivotal moment in Christian history where the question of Gentile inclusion and the role of the law came to a head. The compromise reached at this council would have had far-reaching implications for the shape of Christianity. Acts 15, chapter 15 sets the stage for the conflict. "Certain people have come down from Judea to Antioch, and were teaching the believers, 'Unless you are circumcised, according to the custom taught by Moses, you cannot be saved.' This brought Paul and Barnabas into sharp dispute and debate with them." This passage illustrates the stark differences in perspective between Paul and those who insisted on strict adherence to Jewish law. The debate at the council was intense, with both sides presenting their cases. Peter's speech supports Paul's position, arguing that God had accepted the Gentiles without requiring them to follow the law. However, it was James who proposed the final compromise, as recorded in Acts chapter 15, verses 19 to 20. It is my judgment, therefore, that we should not make it difficult for the Gentiles who are turning to God. Instead, we should write to them, telling them to abstain from food polluted by idols, from sexual immorality, from the meat of strangled animals, and from blood. This compromise, while allowing Gentiles to forego circumcision and full observance of the law, still imposed certain Jewish dietary and moral restrictions. John Painter argues that James's compromise solution at the Jerusalem Council reflects his attempt to bridge the gap between the law-observant Jewish Christians and the Gentile converts. It demonstrates both his authority within the Jerusalem church and his willingness to find a middle ground in the face of this divisive issue. It should be noted that this supposed compromise from James is only found in Acts, a New Testament text authored by Luke, who was, well, buddy-buddy with Paul. Just bear this in mind for now, as in a later section, I'll talk about why it's worth keeping in mind. Despite the apparent resolution at the Jerusalem Council, Paul's letters reveal an ongoing tension with the other apostles. In Galatians chapter 2, verse 6, Paul refers to the original apostles as those who seem to be influential, or pillars, and notes, whatever they were makes no difference to me. God shows no partiality. This somewhat dismissive tone suggests a lack of deference to their authority and hints at underlying tensions. The implications of this attitude are profound and potentially problematic from a theological perspective. Paul's lack of deference to the authority of the original apostles, who had direct contact with Jesus during his ministry, raises serious questions about the basis of his teachings and the legitimacy of his apostleship. James Tabor argues that Paul's dismissive attitude towards the Jerusalem apostles represents a significant break in the chain of authority that we would expect in a religious movement. By asserting his independence from those who walked with Jesus, Paul effectively claims a kind of autonomy that allows him to shape Christian theology according to his own understanding. This autonomy is problematic for several reasons. Number one being departure from eyewitness testimony. The original apostles were eyewitnesses to Jesus' ministry, death, and reported resurrection. Their authority was based on this direct experience. Paul, in contrast, based his apostleship on a personal vision of the risen Christ. Dismissing the importance of the original apostles, Paul potentially disconnects his teachings from the historical Jesus. Second would be lack of accountability. Paul's assertion that the status of the original apostles makes no difference to him suggests a lack of accountability. This attitude could allow Paul to proclaim doctrines and practices that diverge from those taught by Jesus without any check or balance from those who knew Jesus personally. Number three is the potential for theological innovation. Without deference to the authority of the Jerusalem church, Paul was free to develop his own theological interpretations. While this led to the distinctive Pauline theology that forms much of Christian doctrine, it also raises questions about how much of this theology reflects Jesus' original teachings. Number four would be it challenges the church unity. Paul's attitude could be seen as promoting division within the early church. By undermining the authority of the Jerusalem apostles, Paul potentially created competing centers of religious authority, leading to the doctrinal disputes that characterized early Christianity. And finally, 5 hermeneutical issues. Paul's approach raises questions about the interpretation of Jesus' teachings. If Paul felt free to dismiss the authority of those who knew Jesus personally, it suggests he prioritized his own revelatory experiences over the transmitted teachings of Jesus through the apostles. N.T. Wright observes that Paul's complex relationship with the Jerusalem apostles highlights a tension in early Christianity between fidelity to Jesus' teachings as transmitted by his original followers and the dynamic of new revelation claimed by figures like Paul. This tension has profound implications for how we understand the development of Christian theology and the nature of religious authority. The theological ramifications of Paul's attitude extend to fundamental questions about the nature of religious authority and the transmission of religious truth. If Paul could dismiss the authority of those closest to Jesus, it potentially opens the door for anyone to claim direct revelation from God and to teach doctrines that may diverge significantly from the original message. Bart Ehrman points out the potential dangers of this approach, noting that if Paul's claim to authority based on personal revelation, independent of and sometimes in tension with The teachings of Jesus' original followers sets a precedent that could lead to a proliferation of competing claims to divine insight. This raises critical questions about how a religious community can maintain coherence and continuity with its founders' teachings. Furthermore, Paul's attitude could be seen as undermining the very basis of apostolic succession and church authority that became central to many Christian traditions. If the authority of the original apostles could be dismissed, it calls into question the legitimacy of church hierarchies and doctrinal authorities that trace their lineage back to these apostles. The tension between Paul and the original apostles is further exemplified in Paul's recounting of his confrontation with Peter or Cephas in Antioch, as described in Galatians chapter 2, verses 11 to 14. When Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. For before certain men came from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles, but when they arrived, he began to draw back and separate himself from the Gentiles because he was afraid of those who belonged to the circumcision group. The other Jews joined him in his hypocrisy, so that by their hypocrisy even Barnabas was led astray. When I saw that they were not acting in line with the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas in front of them all, "You are a Jew, yet you live like a Gentile and not like a Jew. How is it then that you force Gentiles to follow Jewish customs?" This passage reveals the depth of the ideological rift between Paul and the Jerusalem apostles, even after the council. Paul accuses Peter of hypocrisy, suggesting that the compromise reached in Jerusalem was not fully embraced or consistently applied. However, there is an irony in Paul's accusation of hypocrisy against Peter, given Paul's own admission in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 20 to 21. To the Jews I became like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so as to win those under the law. To those having the law I became like one not having, to those not having the law I became like one not having the law. Though I am not free from God's law, but am under Christ's law, so as to win those not having the law. This juxtaposition reveals a complex and potentially contradictory aspect of Paul's approach to ministry and his relationship with Jewish law and customs. Brian Rosner points out this apparent contradiction, noting that Paul's harsh criticism of Peter's behavior in Antioch stands in tension with his own professed adaptability in different cultural contexts. This raises questions about the consistency of Paul's ethical stance and his understanding of the role of Jewish law in the life of believers. The irony of Paul's position is further emphasized by John M.G. Barclay, who argues that Paul's rebuke of Peter in Antioch for what he perceives as inconsistency is particularly striking when set against Paul's own statement about his chameleon-like behavior in 1 Corinthians 9. This apparent double standard suggests a complex and perhaps not fully resolved tension in Paul's thought regarding the place of Jewish law and custom in the life of the early church. This inconsistency in Paul's approach raises several important questions. Number one, if Paul himself admits to adapting his behavior to different audiences, how can he justifiably criticize Peter for doing essentially the same thing? Number two, Paul accuses Peter of not acting in line with the truth of the gospel, but what exactly does Paul mean by this given his own situational ethics? And number three, what gives Paul the authority to publicly rebuke Peter, one of the original apostles who walked with Jesus, especially when Paul's own behavior could be seen as equally problematic? In rebuking Peter, Paul is also passively suggesting that the men from James are the true corruptors of Christianity. According to Paul's account, it was their presence that caused Peter to deviate from what Paul considered the true gospel. Bart Ehrman states that Paul's letter to the Galatians reveals a deep-seated conflict between his understanding of the gospel and that of the Jerusalem apostles, particularly those associated with James. Paul's strategy in this confrontation is multifaceted. He cannot explicitly condemn James, given James's stature as the brother of Jesus and a key figure in the early Messianic movement. Instead, Paul implies that the men James sent to Antioch must have misrepresented James's views, a situation he suggests has recurred in Galatia. This approach allows Paul to achieve three objectives simultaneously. He denounces the Jamesonian apostles who oppose him. 2, he demonstrates his superiority over Peter. And 3, he expresses his ambivalence towards James himself. James D.G. Dunn observes that Paul's careful wording in Galatians suggests a deliberate attempt to criticize the Jerusalem faction without directly challenging James's authority. The absence of a rebuttal from Peter is notable. It would have been enlightening to have Peter's response to Paul's accusations of hypocrisy, cowardice, and deviation from the gospel. Unfortunately, we have no contemporaneous document from Peter addressing these claims, leaving us with only Paul's version of the events. This one-sided account raises questions about the story's veracity and potential bias. As Raymond Brown points out, the lack of Peter's perspective on this incident leaves us with an incomplete picture, forcing us to rely solely on Paul's potentially biased account. The implications of this confrontation are profound when considered in the broader context of the early Christian tradition. If Peter, who spent years with the historical Jesus, could not correctly understand or apply the gospel message as Paul suggests, how can we be certain that Paul, with his brief visionary experience, has grasped it fully? This paradox becomes even more puzzling when we consider how the canonical Gospels portray the apostles, including instances where Jesus calls Peter Satan for misunderstanding his message in Mark chapter 8, verse 33, and Peter's threefold denial of Jesus, which is found in all four Gospels. John Dominic Cresson notes that the Gospel's negative portrayal of the disciples, particularly Peter, raises questions about the historical reliability of these accounts and their potential influence from Pauline theology. This negative portrayal of the apostles in the Gospels aligns suspiciously well with Paul's criticisms, suggesting that Paul's theology and his conflicts with the Jerusalem church may have significantly influenced the shaping of the Gospel narratives. It's worth noting that the canonical Gospels were written after Paul's genuine letters were composed and widely circulated, raising the possibility that Paul's perspective, or what some might term the lies of Paul, shaped much of the Gospel narrative. As Paula Fredrickson argues, the temporal priority of Paul's letters over the Gospels opens up the possibility that Pauline theology significantly influenced the way the Gospel writers portrayed Jesus and his disciples. A common counter-argument to this perspective might invoke the Council of Rome in 382 CE, suggesting that if Paul truly lacked apostolic authority, this would have been addressed during the Council's deliberations on the biblical canon. However, this argument fails to consider the historical context and the evolution of Christianity between Paul's time and the late 4th century. By 382 CE, Christianity had become predominantly Gentile and was heavily influenced by Pauline thought. The council members were likely from churches that trace their lineage to Paul's missions, or were at least steeped in his theology, which could have significantly shaped their perspective on what should be included in the biblical canon. As Bart Ehrman notes, by the time of the great church councils, the diversity of Christianity had long since disappeared, replaced by the proto-orthodoxy, orthodox views that would eventually dominate the religion. The Council of Rome occurred several centuries after the early Christian period we're discussing. By that time, Pauline Christianity had become the dominant form of the faith, while the Jewish Christian movement associated with James had long since faded into obscurity, partly due to the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE and the subsequent diaspora. The council members may not have had full access to or understanding of the early tensions between Paul and the Jerusalem church. From this perspective, the Council of Rome could be seen not as an objective arbiter of apostolic authority, but as a reflection of the theological views that had already become dominant in the church by the late 4th century. The treatment of James in the New Testament is particularly telling. Despite being the leader of the Nazarenes for 30 years after Jesus' death, according to Josephus, James is almost entirely absent from the primary gospel narratives. If not for the small epistle of James, this crucial figure in early Christianity would have been effectively erased from the New Testament record. Even in the Acts of the Apostles, James is mentioned less than 5 times, I believe, which is striking given his historical importance. Robert Eisenman contends that the marginalization of James in the New Testament, despite his prominence in early Christianity, suggests a deliberate attempt to downplay his role and influence. The marginalization of James raises critical questions. If James was considered an unbeliever during Jesus' ministry, as suggested in John 7:5, why was he chosen as the leader of the Jerusalem church? John Painter addresses this paradox, noting that the tension between the portrayal of James as an unbeliever in John 7:5 and his later prominence in the Jerusalem church raises significant questions about the development of early Christian leadership and the reliability of our sources. If James's knowledge of the gospel and experiences with Jesus were inferior to those of other disciples, what justified his leadership role? The answer is lost in the anti-Jamesonian bias of the author of Acts, reflecting the broader Pauline influence on early Christian writings. Robert Eisenman argues that the minimal role accorded to James in Acts, despite his clear importance in other Christian and historical sources, suggests a deliberate downplaying of his significance, possibly reflecting theological tensions between different strands of early Christianity. This perspective is further supported by Bart D. Ehrman, who observes that the curious absence of James from much of the New Testament narrative, especially given his leadership role attested in other sources, points to a possible bias in our canonical text, perhaps reflecting the eventual triumph of Pauline Christianity over the more Jewish-oriented Christianity of James and the Jerusalem Church. Paul's assertion of acceptance by the Jerusalem apostles, as stated in Galatians 2:9, presents a complex and controversial aspect of early Christian history. He writes, "James, Cephas, and John, those esteemed as pillars, gave me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship when they recognized the grace given to me. They agreed that we should go to the Gentiles, and they to the circumcised." This claim, if taken at face value, would suggest a resolution to the tensions between Paul and the Jerusalem leadership. However, several factors complicate this seemingly straightforward statement. 1. A lack of corroboration. As noted, there are no extant writings from James, Peter, or John that confirm Paul's account. This absence of independent verification is significant, especially given the importance of such an agreement for the early church. Number 2, Paul's agenda. Paul's letter to the Galatians is largely focused on defending his apostleship and his gospel message. In this context, claiming acceptance from the Jerusalem apostles serves Paul's rhetorical purposes. Number 3, continuing tensions. Despite this claimed agreement, Paul's later writings and actions suggest ongoing conflicts with the Jerusalem church, raising questions about the nature and extent of any accord reached. Bart Ehrman elaborates on this issue, stating that Paul's claim of acceptance by the Jerusalem apostles, unsubstantiated by any other early Christian writings, raises significant historical questions. Given the clear tensions that persisted between Paul and the Jerusalem church, we must consider whether Paul's account in Galatians represents more of a diplomatic ideal than a historical reality. The possibility that Paul may have been engaging in a form of self-legitimization, potentially overstating or even fabricating his level of acceptance, has profound implications for our understandings of early Christianity. 1. If Paul's claim is exaggerated or fabricated, it suggests a more fractured early Christian movement with competing centers of authority and divergent theological perspectives. 2. The idea that Paul may have operated without the full backing of the Jerusalem apostles could explain the significant differences between his theology and what we can reconstruct of Jesus' teachings from the Gospels. 3. This perspective challenges traditional narratives of early Christian unity and apostolic suggestion, forcing us to reconsider how we reconstruct the history of the early church. And 4. If we view Paul's statements about his relationship with the Jerusalem apostles skeptically, it necessitates a reevaluation of how we interpret his letters and their claims. John Dominic Crossan offers this insight, suggesting that Paul's assertion of acceptance by the Jerusalem pillars must be read in the context of a larger rhetorical strategy. It's less a historical claim than a theological one, aimed at legitimizing his mission to the Gentiles in the face of opposition from more conservative Jewish Christian elements. Moreover, the specific language Paul uses in Galatians 2:9 is worth closer examination. The phrase right hand of fellowship is unique in the New Testament, and its exact implications are debated among scholars. Craig S. Keener notes that the right hand of fellowship may imply more of a truce or a division of labor than a full theological agreement. Paul's language suggests a diplomatic arrangement rather than a wholehearted endorsement of his mission and message. This nuanced reading suggests that even if we accept Paul's account at face value, the nature of the acceptance he received may have been more limited or conditional than a full endorsement of his apostolic authority and theological positions. Furthermore, Paul's claim must be considered in light of the broader context of factional disputes in early Christianity. Bart Ehrman argues that the early Christian movement was characterized by diversity and conflict, with various groups claiming apostolic authority for their particular interpretations of Jesus' message. Paul's assertion of acceptance by the Jerusalem apostles should be seen as part of this larger context of competing claims to legitimacy. The absence of corroborating evidence for Paul's claim of acceptance is particularly unnerving when we consider the wealth of pseudepigraphical literature that emerged in the early Christian centuries. Despite the proliferation of texts attributed to Peter, James, and other apostles, none of these works, even those favorable to Paul, corroborate his account of being accepted by the Jerusalem leadership. David Trobisch suggests an intriguing possibility, noting that the absence of corroboration for Paul's claim in other early Christian literature, including texts attributed to Peter and James, may indicate that this claim was not widely accepted or known in the early church. This raises the possibility that Paul's account in Galatians represents a minority tradition or even a personal interpretation of events not shared by other early Christian leaders. This claim is supported by other New Testament historians as well. James D. Tabor argues that Paul's assertion of acceptance by the Jerusalem apostles, found only in his own writings, may be seen as a strategic move to assert his own authority. By claiming the support of the pillars of the church, Paul seeks to legitimize his own mission and theology. This perspective suggests that Paul may have been engaging in a form of self-legitimization, potentially overstating or even fabricating the level of acceptance he received from the Jerusalem apostles. While we cannot know for certain, the lack of corroborating evidence from other sources leave room for skepticism about the true nature of Paul's relationship with the original disciples. The evidence presented paints a compelling picture of Paul as a figure whose claims of apostolic acceptance should be viewed with significant skepticism. The lack of corroborating evidence from other early Christian sources, the continuing tensions evident in Paul's own writings, and the insights of modern biblical scholars all point to a more fractured and contentious early Christian movement than the traditional narratives suggest. Paul's assertion of acceptance by the Jerusalem apostles appears increasingly likely to be a strategical, rhetorical move rather than an accurate historical account. This revelation fundamentally challenges the basis of Paul's authority and, by extension, the theological foundations he laid for much of Christian doctrine. Given the profound influence Paul's writings have had on Christian theology, the skepticism toward his claims of apostolic approval should prompt a serious reevaluation of his role in shaping Christian theology. It seems clear that Paul's version of Christianity, far from being universally accepted by the early church, was likely a controversial and possibly a minority view that gained prominence through Paul's skilled rhetoric and prolific writing rather than through true apostolic endorsement. To fully understand the tension between Paul and the original apostles, it's crucial to consider Jesus' own teachings on the law as recorded in the Gospels. Jesus' statement about the law often present a different perspective from Paul's characterization of it as a yoke of slavery, or something from which believers need to be released. In Matthew 5:17-20, Jesus says, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen, will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Therefore, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commands and teaches others accordingly will be called least in the kingdom of heaven, but whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven." This passage presents a contrast to Paul's teachings about the law. Jesus affirms the continuing validity of the law and even emphasizes the importance of following and teaching its commands. This aligns more closely with the perspective of James and the Jerusalem apostles than with Paul's view of the law as something that needs to be transcended or left behind. As a small form of irony, the very last line in the quote mentions surpassing the Pharisees in righteousness. Guess who was a trained Pharisee among the apostles? Indeed, it was Paul. Perhaps Jesus was actually making a minor prophecy here about the duplicitous and unrighteous Pharisee who would abandon the law and instead encourage his followers to encourage Jesus' own followers to uphold it. Bruce Chilton observes that Jesus' affirmation of the law in Matthew 5:17-20 provides a foundation for understanding James's perspective. As Jesus' brother and a leader of the Jerusalem church, James likely saw his commitment to the law as a continuation of Jesus' own teachings, rather than a departure from them. Furthermore, in Matthew 11:30, Jesus describes his teaching in a way that contrasts sharply with Paul's characterization of the law. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Where Paul sees the law as a burden, Jesus presents his teachings, which include adherence to the law, as something manageable and light. Here we can see direct contradiction between Paul's teachings and what Jesus taught. This discrepancy between Jesus' words about the law and Paul's teachings highlights the complexity of the early Christian movement's relationship with Jewish law and tradition. It also provides context for understanding why the Jerusalem apostles, who had direct experience with Jesus' teachings, might have been skeptical of Paul's more radical break from the law. In Galatians 3:1, Paul chastises the Galatians for their foolishness and questions who has bewitched them, emphasizing that Jesus Christ was clearly portrayed as crucified before their very eyes. This verse suggests that the Galatians were wavering in their belief or understanding of the crucifixion. Paul's tone indicates frustration and urgency, highlighting that the acceptance of the crucifixion was not a given among early believers. Bart Ehrman notes that Paul's need to remind the Galatians of Jesus' crucifixion suggests that there was considerable confusion or even denial about this event among early Christians. The struggle to affirm the crucifixion suggests that alternative views or skepticism were present within the community. Similarly, in 1 Corinthians 2, chapter 2, verse 2, Paul declares, "For I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified." This verse underscores Paul's determination to focus on the crucifixion as the core of his message. The necessity of such a declaration implies that the crucifixion was a point of contention or confusion among the Corinthians as well. Paul's insistence on this message reflects an ongoing effort to convince the Corinthians of its truth and importance. Larry Hurtado observes that Paul's emphasis on the crucifixion in his letters indicates that this was not a universally accepted or understood event within early Christian communities. Paul's acknowledgement of the crucifixion's contentious nature is further evidenced in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 verse 23, where he states, "But we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and a foolishness to Gentiles." This verse highlights the broader cultural and religious challenges Paul faced. For Jews, the concept of a crucified Messiah was scandalous, while for Gentiles it appeared nonsensical. Paul's message was radical and countercultural, requiring persistent effort to gain acceptance among his diverse audiences. The idea of a divine figure who dies and rises again, however, was not entirely alien to the Hellenistic religious landscape. This cultural context made it somewhat easier for Gentile converts to accept Paul's message of a crucified and resurrected Christ, although it still required explanation and reinforcement. In Philippians 3:18-19, Paul warns those who live as enemies of the cross of Christ, whose end is destruction, whose God is their belly, and whose glory is in their shame. Here Paul identifies internal opposition to the crucifixion message, suggesting that some within the Christian community actively resisted or distorted this teaching. The strong language indicates that these opponents were a significant concern for Paul, necessitating repeated admonitions and clarifications. Ehrman asserts that Paul's reference to the enemies of the cross reflect an internal struggle within the early Christian movement and over the acceptance of the crucifixion. Paul's letter to the Galatians is a key document in understanding these tensions. In Galatians 1, Paul defends his apostleship and gospel message, asserting that he received it directly from Jesus Christ and not from any human authority. He mentions his visit to Jerusalem and meeting with James and Peter to validate his message. Paul's insistence that he is not lying in Galatians 1:20 suggests that his credibility was under attack, likely by those sent by James to correct what they perceived as Paul's deviant teachings. Ehrman remarks that Paul's defensive tone in Galatians reflects the intense pressure he faced from those who questioned his authority and message. These Jamesonian apostles, as they are often referred to, likely challenged Paul's authority and message, accusing him of being an unauthorized teacher. This accusation would have undermined Paul's position and necessitated a strong defense. Paul's portrayal of these opponents as false brethren in Galatians 2:4 and his recounting of his confrontation with Peter in Galatians 2:11-14 are strategic moves to assert his authority and discredit his critics. Hurtado notes that Paul's conflict with the Jerusalem church and his characterization of his opponents reveal the deep divisions within the early Christian movement. Marcion's early version of Galatians, which omits verses 8-24 of chapter 1, further complicates the picture. These verses include Paul's account of his visit to Jerusalem, which was crucial for establishing his legitimacy. The omission of these verses in Marcion's version suggests that the idea that Paul had gone to Jerusalem to get James's approval to teach was not found in earlier versions of Galatians and could likely have been later addition to the text by Gentile supporters and students of Paul. Despite the tensions with the Jerusalem apostles and the apparent divergence from Jesus' teachings of the law, Paul's version of Christianity ultimately became the dominant form of the faith. Several factors contributed to this outcome. Firstly, Paul's extensive travels and missionary work allowed him to establish churches across a wide geographical area. His ability to write and disseminate letters to these churches gave him a platform to spread his theological ideas far beyond Jerusalem. Paula Fredrickson notes that Paul's tireless missionary journeys and his prolific letter writing created a network of Gentile Christian communities across the Mediterranean. These communities, unencumbered by Jewish law, were more accessible to Gentile converts and grew rapidly. Secondly, Paul's education and background as a Pharisee and Roman citizen gave him unique advantages. Unlike the original apostles, who were described as unschooled ordinary men in Acts 4:13, Paul was highly educated and could engage with both Jewish and Greco-Roman intellectual traditions. A. N. Wilson argues that Paul's sophisticated theological arguments and his ability to navigate both Jewish and Hellenistic thought made his teachings particularly appealing to educated Gentiles. His letters demonstrated a level of intellectual engagement that set him apart from the more practically oriented teachings of the Jerusalem church. Thirdly, the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE had a profound impact on the balance of power within the early Christian movement. With the Jerusalem church scattered and its influence diminished, Paul's Gentile-oriented Christianity faced less opposition. Wayne Meeks observes that the fall of Jerusalem in 70 CE marked a turning point in early Christianity. With the Jewish Christian center decimated, Paul's Gentile churches became the new center of gravity for the Christian movement, cementing dominance of his theological perspective. Lastly, Paul's emphasis on faith over works and his message of freedom from the law had a broad appeal, especially to Gentile converts who may have found the requirements of Jewish law daunting. E.P. Sanders notes that Paul's theology of justification by faith alone offered a more accessible path to salvation for Gentiles. By removing the barrier of Jewish law, Paul opened the door for widespread Gentile conversion, fundamentally altering the demographic makeup of the early Christian movement. Now, I just want to take a look at the historical corroboration behind all the things that Paul supposedly did. So, the book of Acts provides the primary narrative account of Paul's activities outside of his own letters. But there are discrepancies between Acts and his letters, which raises questions about the historical reliability of both. For instance, Paul's conversion experience is described differently in his own account in Galatians and in Acts. If you compare Galatians 1:15-17 and Acts 9:1-19, or 22:6-16, or 26:12-18. Gerd Ludemann argues that these discrepancies suggest a later legendary development of Paul's conversion story. The number of visits to Jerusalem also differs between Paul's account in Galatians 1-2, 2 visits, and Acts, 5 visits. Philip F. Essler suggests that Acts deliberately alters Paul's itinerary to present a more unified picture of early Christianity, where he was consistently meeting with the apostles in Jerusalem. Furthermore, Paul's description of a public confrontation with Peter in Antioch is entirely omitted from Acts. John M. G. Barclay argues that this omission in Acts reflects a later attempt to downplay conflicts among early Christian leaders. The significant omissions in Acts regarding Paul's life and ministry further complicate our understanding of Paul's historical reality. Acts never mentions Paul writing any letters, which formed a crucial part of his ministry. Richard Purvo argues that this omission suggests Acts was written at a time when Paul's letters were not yet widely circulated or recognized as authoritative. Similarly, Paul's extensive efforts to collect money for the Jerusalem church, mentioned in Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and Galatians, is barely alluded to in Acts. Dieter Georgi suggests that this omission in Acts reflects a later attempt to downplay tensions between Paul and the Jerusalem church. Beyond mere factual discrepancies, scholars have noted significant theological differences between Paul's letters and Acts. Paul's letters often present a high Christology, equating Jesus with God, like in Philippians 2, 5-11, while Acts generally presents a lower Christology, focusing on Jesus as Messiah rather than divine. Bart Ehrman argues that this difference reflects the development of Christology over time, with Acts preserving earlier, less developed views. Similarly, Paul's letters emphasize freedom from the law for Gentile believers, while Acts presents a more accommodating view towards Jewish law. James D.G. Dunn suggests that Acts softens Paul's radical stance on the law to make him more acceptable to Jewish Christian readers. The complete absence of contemporary non-Christian references to Paul is problematic for establishing his historical credibility. Despite Paul's claim to have been a prominent Pharisee, there is no mention of him in any contemporary Jewish sources. Chaim Maccoby argues that this silence casts doubt on Paul's claims about his Jewish background. Similarly, no Roman records mention Paul's trials or imprisonments, despite his claim in 2 Corinthians 11 of multiple arrests and beatings. The riot in Ephesus, described in Acts 19, is not corroborated by any known contemporary source, and Paul's shipwreck on Malta in Acts 27 and 28 is not recorded in any known Roman maritime records. Josephus, who wrote extensively about Jewish history and religious movements of the first century, never mentions Paul. Philo of Alexandria, a contemporary Jewish philosopher, is silent about both Jesus and Paul, despite writing about religious movements in Judea. Frank Zindler argues that this silence from contemporary historians is evidence against the historical existence of both Jesus and Paul, though I personally don't have any doubts about the existence of Jesus. The relative silence about Paul in early non-Pauline Christian writings is equally puzzling. The Epistle of James, often seen as a response to Paul's teachings, never mentions Paul by name. Dale Allison Jr. suggests that this may reflect early controversies surrounding Paul's teachings. The Gospels, while presumably written after Paul's ministry, never mention him or his impact on early Christianity. Dennis R. MacDonald argues that this silence may indicate that Paul's influence was not as widespread in the first century as traditionally assumed. While later Christian historians do mention Paul, their accounts are problematic for establishing Paul's historical credibility. Eusebius, from the 4th century, provides extensive information about Paul in his ecclesiastical history. However, Robert M. Grant demonstrates that Eusebius primarily relied on earlier Christian sources, including the New Testament itself, rather than independent historical records. Timothy T. Barnes argues that Eusebius often manipulated his sources to support his view of church history. Jerome provides a biography of Paul on illustrious men. However, his account relies heavily on Acts and the Pauline epistles, adding little independent historical information. Andrew Kane shows how Jerome's portrayal of Paul is shaped by his own ascetic ideals. The few pagan sources that mention Paul or early Christianity provide little support for Paul's historical claims. Lucian of Samosata mentions Christians and their beliefs in the passing of Peregrinus. However, his knowledge appears to be based on contemporary Christian practices rather than historical records of Paul's time. Robert Louis Wilkin argues that Lucian's account tells us more about how Christianity was perceived in the 2nd century than about the historical Paul. The manuscript tradition of Paul's letters also presents significant challenges to establishing their historical reliability. For example, Romans 5:1 has variations in different manuscripts, with some reading "we have peace with God," while others read "let us have peace with God." Bart Ehrman argues that such variations demonstrate how theological concerns influence the transmission of the text. Many scholars believe that 1 Corinthians 14:34-35, which instructs women to be silent in churches, was not part of Paul's original letter. Gordon Fee argues that these verses contradict Paul's earlier statements about women's roles and disrupt the flow of the text. Philip B. Payne provides extensive text-critical evidence that these verses were a later interpolation. And these are just a few examples. I'm sure you could find many, many more. While archaeological evidence can provide valuable context for understanding Paul's world, it offers little direct corroboration of his specific claims. The Delphi inscription mentioning Gallio as proconsul of Achaia helps date Paul's stay in Corinth. However, Jerome Murphy O'Connor cautions against overinterpreting this evidence, noting that it only provides a general chronological framework. The Ephesian theater mentioned in Acts 19:29 has been excavated, but this only confirms the setting, not the events described. Paul Trebilco argues that while archaeology confirms the general settings of Acts, it cannot verify specific events. While shipwreck sites have been found near Malta, none can definitively be linked to Paul's account in Acts chapters 27 and 28. Understanding the socio-historical context of Paul's writings raises further questions about their historical reliability. Albert Schweitzer argued that Paul's thought was heavily influenced by mystery cults and apocalyptic Judaism. Troels Engberg Peterson demonstrates significant parallels between Paul's ethics and Stoic philosophy. These influences raise questions about the originality and historical basis of Paul's teachings. The development and diversity of Pauline theology in the early church further complicates our understanding of the historical Paul. John Knox argued that Marcion's version of Paul's letters may predate our canonical versions. This raises questions about the authenticity of the Pauline corpus as we have it. Elaine Pagels demonstrates how Gnostic Christians interpreted Paul in radically different ways from Proto-Orthodox Christianity. This diversity of interpretation raises questions about what Paul actually taught.